Today I thought we'd look at some literary vocabulary for fiction. So when we think of literary devices for fiction, we're going to look at the different elements of literature first, like the setting, the plot, the character, the points of view, the themes. We'll also look at some of them that break down the conflicts, the moods, the dialogue. And then, of course, if we look at other literary devices, such as using figurative language, flashbacks and foreshadowings, and other rhetorical devices and sensory details. So let's go ahead and start with our elements of literature. The setting of a story is the time and place in which it occurs. Now, elements of setting may include physical, psychological, cultural, or historical background against which the story takes place. So usually when we talk about setting in time and place, a lot of times we're talking about some sort of physical and historical background, but they can also include the psychological and cultural backgrounds. When we talk about the mood of a story, it's the atmosphere or feeling that's being created by the writer, and usually that is expressed through the setting. Because we're looking at the time and place, we're also looking at psychological and cultural elements. They're going to strike a mood. What is the feeling as they start setting in your mind, as you're viewing or as you're reading? What is the place like? How does it feel to you and to the first characters who are put into that setting? The next element that we'll be looking at is plot. Now, plot is the basic sequence of events in a story. Now, in conventional stories, plot has 5 parts, and you can see I've got the picture of the plotline triangle below. You start with the exposition, then we move into the rising action. You get to the climax, there's a much shorter falling action after, and then finally the resolution of the story. Now, a flashback can be used usually towards the very beginning of a story. It's a literary device by which a work presents material that occurred prior to the opening scene. So various methods are used in order to create flashbacks. Maybe perhaps it's a recollection of a character. They will stop the story in order to give you their recollection. It could be narration by the characters. Your narrator might try to give you more information as the story has already progressed. There can be dream sequences. A lot of times we have this when people are viewing a TV show or some sort of play or some sort of movie. And reveries, where people have some sort of ideas about what has happened to them in the past, what has happened to somebody else in the past. It's very psychological. The opposite of that would be foreshadowing. Now, foreshadowing is the presentation of material in a work in such a way that later events are then prepared for. So the purpose of foreshadowing is to prepare the reader or viewer for the action that is to come. So the flashback is going to give you information from what has happened previously. Foreshadowing is giving you material in the hopes that you can realize what is about to happen or what is coming in the future. Now, foreshadowing can result from the establishment of a mood or atmosphere. You can establish that with our setting. Foreshadowing can come from an event that adumbrates a later action. So it might have an event and it might be kind of tipping you off as to what else might happen. Foreshadowing can result from the appearance of physical objects or facts. All of a sudden you learn something that wasn't there before, and that might give you a clue as to something that might happen in the future. And then lastly, foreshadowing can result from the revelation of a fundamental and decisive character trait. All of a sudden, you've learned something new about your character, and now you can make an educated guess as to how they might react later. So next, as we take a look at all of these different elements of literature, there's also figurative language that comes into play. So let's start with the simile and metaphor. They do have a lot in common. They are a comparison of two unlike things. However, with the simile, you're doing an indirect comparison where you're using the word like or as. For example, oh, my love is like a red, red rose. You're comparing love and you're comparing the rose, and you have the word like. Now, a metaphor is going to be that subtle comparison in which the author describes a person or thing using words that are not meant to be taken literally. However, it is still a direct comparison of two unlike things. You'll notice the verb to be being used. For example, time is a dressmaker specializing in alterations. The next two pieces of figurative language we have are imagery and alliteration. So imagery is the use of language to create mental images and sensory impressions. Think of your five senses. Imagery is going to have a tendency to use your five senses in order to create these sensory impressions. Now, imagery can be used for emotional effect and to intensify the impact on the reader. For example, if you were going to be describing sorrow, you might want to add such sweet sorrow. There's a bit of an opposite there. Usually sweet has a positive connotation and sorrow has such a negative connotation that they're creating or evoking an image that there's something positive and negative. There's this pull towards both. Alliteration is the repetition of the same sounds at the beginning of two or more adjacent words or stressed syllables. So when we take a look at alliteration, it has to be a consonant sound and it has to be at the beginning of your word. For example, from the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, we would have furrow followed free. The F sounds at the beginnings of those words creates an alliteration. Next, what we have for figurative language is personification. Now, if you take a non-human thing or an abstract idea and you represent it as having a human quality. For example, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair. Well, a tree can't wear anything and it certainly doesn't have hair. But we can still understand that in summertime a tree might have a nest of robins, but we're giving it that personification, we're giving it a human-like quality by saying that it might wear something and it has something in its hair. The next figurative language is onomatopoeia, and that would be the use of words that sound exactly what they mean. So if you're going to be creating a sound that an animal makes, such as a bee is buzzing, a horse is neighing, the way you spell out those words and use that word would be considered an onomatopoeia because you've spelled out a sound. We have an example from poetry. How about the bells from Edgar Allan Poe? Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night. So the tinkling of those bells in the icy air, that tinkle sound would be onomatopoeia. Our next pieces of figurative language, we have the hyperbole, where an intentionally exaggerated figure of speech is done for emphasis or effect. There is the understanding of exaggeration. So if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, there is the understanding I have not literally told you something 1,000 times. So you understand there's that exaggeration there. For example, all of the perfumes of Arabia could not sweeten this little hand, as Macbeth had said in William Shakespeare. So that would be a lot of perfumes from Arabia to test. I have a feeling Macbeth hasn't tested all of them, but it's understood that that's an exaggeration. An idiom can also be a bit of an exaggeration, but what it is an expression that has a different meaning from its literal meaning of its individual words. Now, idioms are particular to a given language, and it usually can't be translated literally. For example, if something is under the weather. Now, usually weather consummates up in the sky, and so usually we'd be under the weather, but that's not what it means. Under the weather means you're ill or sick. Another good idiom would be if I said, it's raining cats and dogs. You would have the understanding that cats and dogs are not literally falling from the sky as rain. That would be dangerous for you and, of course, for the cats and dogs. But you would have an understanding that it's pouring rain very hard outside. It's likely you don't want to be out in it. A rhetorical device is a technique that an author or speaker uses to evoke an emotional response. And there's lots of different types of figurative language you might use, like an analogy, a simile, a metaphor. And you use this in order to persuade or influence their audience. So if you're using rhetorical devices, you are trying to persuade your audience by evoking an emotional response. So we have gone through setting, mood, plot, flashback, and foreshadowing, which we usually see as an element of fiction. And then we've had rhetorical devices and the several different figurative languages, such as simile, metaphor, imagery, alliteration, personification, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, and idioms. Thanks so much for stopping by to learn a little bit more about the elements of fiction. If you'd like to learn more, I've got more on my playlist, so please continue checking out my channel. As always, I'd appreciate if you would subscribe. Leave a note down in the comments if I've missed something you'd like to learn more. Thanks for stopping by.